2025 is the year of Eevee, and in this video, we're going to be discussing all of Eevee's evolutions to celebrate that. Eevee is a fan favorite, sitting right up there with the likes of Charizard and Pikachu in terms of popularity, and it's not hard to see why. It is absolutely adorable, and makes the most of one of Pokemon's core mechanics, evolution. Having your Pokemon transform and become stronger as you progress through the games has always been super exciting. However, you always know where you're going to end up. Squirtle will always be a Wartortle. Wartortle will always become a Blastoise. But Eevee takes that element of the game and puts it in the player's hands, offering you a choice to evolve it into many different forms. Whether you want to round out your team, have a Pokemon of your favorite type, or just want to choose a design that you really enjoy, Eevee and their evolutions will always be able to give you what you want. And that's kind of what Pokemon is all about, having the ability to create your perfect team from the countless options available and to personalize your adventure. And what better way to celebrate that than taking a look at every Eeveelution and what makes them special? All of which, of course, starts with Eevee. Eevee is a normal type Pokemon from the first generation that is loosely based on a mixture of a fox, a dog, and a cat. In a 2018 art book, Motofumi Fujiwara, the person who actually designed Eevee, explained that Satoshi Tajiri specifically asked him to create a Pokemon which could evolve into multiple types. And so Eevee was created as a sort of blank slate, not really based on any specific animal so that any potential evolution could feel possible. And that's why we see all of Eevee's evolutions taking inspiration from things like lynxes, mermaids, foxes, cats. It covers a pretty wide spectrum, and as an extension of this, they wanted to make Eevee as memorable and pet-like as possible. That said, the fox-like elements were likely included, as foxes are often associated with being shapeshifters in Japanese folklore, which could lean into this theme of multiple forms. In many ways, Eevee is also kind of meant to feel like a secondary starter for the players. It is this rare Pokemon that couldn't be caught in the wild, at least in the early games, but which is given to you during your journey along with the choice of which type you want to play with. In fact, your rival even starts with an Eevee in Pokemon Yellow, and years later in the Let's Go games, Eevee was selected as the secondary starter option in contrast to Pikachu. And while we're on the subject of the early games though, our rival in the original games actually has a really cool mechanic that is tied to Eevee. In Pokemon Yellow, depending on the results of your first battle against your rival, their Eevee will evolve into different things. If the player wins both of their battles, they will evolve into a Jolteon. If you win one and lose one, they will evolve into a Flareon, and if you lose both battles, they will evolve into a Vaporeon. For a long time, Eevee kind of held a gift Pokemon position. In the Kanto games, we'd received them from the Celadon Mansion. In Johto, we got it from Bill in Goldenrod City. In Sinnoh, we were gifted them from BB in Hearthhome City. In Black and White 2, you can get them from Amanita in Castelia Park. And it wasn't until Generation 6 where Eevee would become regularly and easily available outside of these gift events. Now, on their own, Eevee isn't all that powerful. I mean, it's a first stage normal Pokemon. They aren't exactly famous for being strong. However, there are two ways that Game Freak tried to make it more effective. One of these is the partner Eevee that you get in Let's Go Eevee. This Pokemon had a pretty considerable stat boost in comparison to your run-of-the-mill Eevees, having base stats of 435 rather than 325, getting a 20-point boost in every stat other than HP where it only got 10. This was to make up for the fact that you couldn't evolve your partner Pokemon. Despite that, this still made them pretty strong, especially in the early game. And this was supplemented by Let's Go's partner Pokemon getting exclusive moves. In Pikachu's case, they were given 4 powerful attacks to round them out in battle. However, Eevee was given 9 unique moves, representing each of their would-be evolutions, as well as the normal typing. The second attempt to make Eevee more usable came in Generation 8, as Eevee was given a Gigantamax form. Along with an Eeveeolite and the HP buff from Gigantamaxing, this could make it an okay-ish Pokemon to use in battle. Still not great, but the real appeal came from their unique G-move, G-Max Cuddle, which was a spread move which, along with dealing damage, could infatuate Pokemon of the opposite gender. However, if you ask me, the whole point of having an Eevee is to not keep it as an Eevee. I mean, it's right there in the name. You're supposed to evolve it. That didn't super land, but we're going to roll with it and talk about how Eevee evolves. To date, Eevee has been given 8 different evolutions, each of which has their own unique type, as well as a matching evolution method to the forms added in their respective generations. For example, in Generation 1 we were given 3 possible evolutions, which could be achieved through evolution stones. Gen 1 is lousy with Pokemon who evolved with elemental stones. It was a pretty core mechanic for the games. In fact, 16 different Pokemon evolved with evolutionary stones in that generation, which is pretty considerable and makes up for about a quarter of the evolutionary lines in that generation. The first 3 Eeveelutions were Jolteon, who you would get with a Thunderstone, Flareon, who you would get through a Firestone, and Vaporeon, who you would get through a Water Stone. Generation 2 added the Day and Night cycle, as well as friendship-based evolutions, and so Eevee received a friendship evolution for both times, Espeon in the day and Umbreon in the night. Generation 3 didn't have any new Eeveelutions, but in Gen 4 we got another pair. These games added environmental requirements for a few Pokemon to evolve, for example, Nosepass and Magneton, and so we received Eeveelutions in Leafeon and Glaceon, who evolved when close to the Moss and Ice Rocks respectively. Gen 5 was skipped, and finally in Generation 6 we were introduced to the Fairy-type and Pokemon Eevee. And if Eevee leveled up while having a Fairy-type move, as well as some Affection Hearts in Pokemon Eevee, you could get Sylveon. Though this method has been adjusted as Pokemon Eevee has been taken out of subsequent games. Of note, there are a few overlaps shared between all Eeveelutions. First of all is their names, all will end with Eon. Second is that they are brought up to a base stat total of 525, and in each case, these evolutions will be given one stat of 60, 2 of 65, 1 of 90, 1 of 110, and 1 of 130, which will be distributed differently for each of them. The third point is kind of a fun one, though not confirmed. In games prior to the physical special split, Pokemon moves were divided into categories based on their type rather than what the move actually did. For example, despite Fire Punch being a move that would make physical contact with the opponent, because it was a Fire-type move, it was coded to be a special attack. And so, any moves which were of the following types were always special. These were Electric, Fire, Water, Ice, Grass, Psychic, Dark, and Dragon. Of note, all of Eevee's evolutionary types fall into this category with the exception of Sylveon, as fairy types were not introduced at the time. And this is actually why so many people have been waiting for a Dragon-type Eeveelution for so long. Before moving on though, if you ever used an Eevee, you might have thought about how cool it would be to be able to swap between forms. Or maybe you've accidentally made a Flareon, but you needed a Vaporeon. Well, in the Pokemon Adventures manga, Red catches an Eevee that was experimented on by Team Rocket. As a result, it gains the ability to change between any of its Gen 1 evolutions at will. That said, they later did permanently evolve into an Espeon, but it was cool while it lasted. Aside from that, we've also seen trainers or groups having connections to Eevee's evolutions throughout the series. The first big one was the Kimono Girls in Johto, which was a group of 5 women which each had one of the 5 Eeveelutions available at the time. Their role was elevated in the Gen 2 remakes, as they give the players the clear or tidal bell and perform dances that summon Ho-Oh and Lugia. Most recently, in Gen 9, we had Penny, who used a full team of Eeveelutions, using all of them except Espeon and Glaceon, which is unfortunate because those two are actually my favorite. But now that we have all the background information in place, we can finally move on to talking about Eeveelutions, starting with Jolteon. However, before we get into it, if you enjoy this Pokemon content, remember to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more in the future. We have a couple videos out already covering things like all of the legendary Pokemon, all of the mythical Pokemon, and all of the Pokemon that Ash used in his adventure. You can definitely check that one out after this one, but without any more delays, let's talk about Jolteon. Jolteon is the result of evolving Eevee with a Thunderstone, and is one of the 2 Eeveelutions who was also designed by Motofumi Fujiwara, this being along with Flareon, and interestingly enough, all 3 of these Pokemon have these same diamond-shaped ears, while Vaporeon, the only one not designed by them, has those unique fin-shaped ears. The name Jolteon comes from combining a jolt of electricity with the Eeveelution's Eon ending. However, we have something kind of fun when looking at the Japanese name, as it is, shockingly similar to Zapdos's name. Zapdos's name in Japanese is Sanda, or Thunder, while Jolteon's is completely unique, being Sandasu, or Thunders. It's pretty peak design. They basically threw on an S and said, that's fine. Anyways, back to our lightning fast fox. This Pokemon makes electricity using an organ in its lungs, which crackles when it breathes. It can store electricity in its cells and charges up its fur with negative ions, letting it fire 10,000 volt bolts at its enemies. This essentially makes Jolteon into a living lightning bolt, with jagged spikes that make up its mane and coat. These sharp charged needles make sparks when it moves and can even be launched out of its body when it becomes agitated. Even once detached from its body though, Jolteon's quills can hold electrical charge for quite some time, making them a pretty dangerous Pokemon overall. This design is likely inspired by the Raiju, an embodiment of lightning in animal form from Japanese myth. And if you believe that Jolteon was the Pokemon in the Tin Tower that Ho-Oh resurrected and turned into Raikou, then this idea of it being a Raiju actually fits even more. Even without being reborn into a Raikou though, Jolteon is made especially useful thanks to their 130 in speed and 110 in special attack, allowing them to be an effective Volt Switch user or to be brought out to take out slower opponents. Throw in Jolteon's Volt Absorb ability for a free switch in here and there, and they can actually be very fun and threatening to use, though it does have a pretty limited move pool when it comes to coverage. Even so, we've seen Jolteon be used by some pretty heavy hitters in the Pokemon world. First and most iconically is of course Blue's Jolteon in Pokemon Yellow, which as I mentioned he will use if you beat him in both of your first encounters. In this case he will have a Ninetales rather than a Flareon and a Cloyster rather than a Vaporeon, in addition to having a Sandslash, Alakazam, and an Exeggutor. If Jolteon is not present in Blue's team, then he will have a Magneton instead. Later in Pokemon Platinum, Volkner would open up with a Jolteon, though for some reason he uses a physical build on his Jolteon, which just tells me that Volkner is a terrible trainer. Luckily, by the time we fight him in the Sinnoh Leaders Tournament in Black and White 2, he has figured out that Jolteon is a special attacker. And ultimately, in their BDSP rematch, their Jolteon is actually pretty excellent, making use of a Toxic Orb along with the Quick Feed ability to become blindingly fast and really difficult to deal with. Vaporeon is the result of an Eevee touching a water stone and is in current years one of the more infamous Eeveelutions, but definitely for the wrong reasons. Luckily, we don't have to talk about that in this video, and instead we can focus on things like its Pokédex entry from Red and Blue, where Vaporeon is mentioned as the Pokemon that inspired the belief of mermaids in the Pokemon world, and this is because of its design. Atsuki Nishida made this Pokemon with mermaids in mind, interestingly making it the only Eeveelution in the original 3 to have a specific reference rather than just kind of embodying the element that they're tied to. While Jolteon is just kind of a jagged living lightning bolt, and Flareon just kind of has tufts of fur that look like fire, Vaporeon actually has some interesting design elements. It has a long mermaid-like tail with a spiky ridge that runs up its back. However, the most iconic part of its design is easily its head. Vaporeon has this big, frilly mane with a dorsal fin at the top of their head, and these large fin-like ears that really work together to make it feel like it belongs in the ocean. As I mentioned, there is a pretty stark difference between Jolteon and Flareon's appearance in contrast to Vaporeon, and that is because they are the only one of the original 3 created by Atsuko Nishida. However, all Eeveelutions after the original 3 were created by them as well. Vaporeon's name comes from the idea of water vapor, which is fitting since its body composition is so similar to water molecules that it can practically disappear and melt into water to become completely camouflaged. Meanwhile, the Japanese name Shawazu, or showers, pairs with Jolteon's thunders to be kind of connected to the idea of storms, something that we don't see in Flareon. Speaking of Japan though, Vaporeon was actually selected as Japan's Water Day Ambassador in 2021 by the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, Transport, and Tourism, and still serves as its mascot to this day. And we've seen similar initiatives with Pokemon like Lapras, Slowpoke, and Geodude, though none of the other Eeveelutions have ever received this treatment. In-game though, Vaporeon is a pretty interesting Pokemon. Like Jolteon, they have 110 in special attack, which means they can hit decently hard. However, they also have a 95 in special defense, and they are the only one of the Eeveelutions to have their highest stat of 130 in health, making them incredibly bulky. Throw in moves like Haze, Acid Armor, Wish, and the chance to burn with things like Scald, and you have a very difficult wall to overcome. Or you could try out a Sleep Talk set similar to something you might do with Suicune, which is fitting as many people believe that Vaporeon was the Pokemon that Ho-Oh resurrected to make Suicune, and having this kind of shared move pool is kind of a cool touch. Ash and his friends encounter numerous Vaporeon throughout their journey. Some of them were nice and helpful, like Galea's Vaporeon, who helped train Ash's Corphish, and Virgil's Vaporeon, who played with Pikachu, while others, like Ursula's, acted as a rival on the performance stage. Now, on to our final of the original trio, Flareon, the Pokemon that Eevee will evolve into if it has a Firestone. While Jolteon and Vaporeon's Japanese names come from weather words, Flareon's name, Booster, is instead a reference to booster rockets, which is pretty out of place here. As for their design, Flareon is the last one that Motofumi Fujiwara created, which explains their similar head and ear shape to Jolteon. Meanwhile, the rest of their body resembles tufts of flame that make up their tail, mane, and hair. Despite their simple appearance, Flareon is easily the most dangerous of the Eeveelutions thanks to the flame pouch inside its body. This allows them to hold a supply of air which they can heat up to 3,000 degrees Celsius. As a result of this, the rest of Flareon's body can have a resting average temperature of 1,700 degrees, which it needs to regulate through releasing heat through its fiery collar. It's because of this intense heat that Flareon was classified the Flame Pokemon, and while most categories are tied to 1 or 2 Pokemon at a time, and often will have Pokemon in the same family, Flareon shares this group with Charmeleon, Charizard, Moltres, and Infernape, making it one of the largest categories in the series. In-game though, Flareon stands unique from Vaporeon and Jolteon as the only physical attacker of the group, having its highest stat in attack, while also having decent special bulk. Where Flareon becomes a bit awkward to use though is its next highest stat being special attack, rather than putting those points into things like speed or other defenses, which might be more useful. On top of that, prior to the physical special split, fire-type attacks were all special, which means that Flareon wouldn't be able to make use of its strongest stat very effectively, though in the modern era this problem has been solved. Since then, Flareon has had quite a bit of a glow-up, getting access to powerful moves like Flare Blitz and abilities like Flash Fire. Or you could use Guts, which can be taken advantage of through things like Toxic Orb, in a similar way to how Jolteon can use this to activate Quick Feet. On that note, you might have noticed that each of the original 3 Eeveelutions has an ability that allows them to absorb their own element, or which is tied to them having a status condition, or in Vaporeon's case, curing that status condition. Moving on to Gen 2, and we have a new set of Eeveelutions, though unlike the original trio, Espeon and Umbreon evolve through friendship depending on the time of day, with Espeon being far more offensive while Umbreon is far more defensive. This made them perfect to serve as the partner Pokemon for Wes in Pokemon Colosseum, giving us our first time using the Eevee line as starter Pokemon, which we wouldn't see again until the Let's Go Eevee game. Starting with Espeon, who evolves through friendship during the day. As the name suggests, Espeon is a psychic type making use of ESP, or extrasensory perception, which is where their psychic powers comes from. This is amplified by Espeon's fur, which is so sensitive that it can sense the tiniest changes in the air and allow them to predict the movements of those around them to the point it seems like they are reading minds, and will even allow them to predict changes to the weather. The gem on Espeon's forehead is the crux of its abilities, allowing them to store up energy from sunlight and then repurpose it into psychic power, though as a result of this it struggles to battle at night and will often go into a deep sleep to conserve its strength. This gem likely pulls inspiration from the carbuncle, coming from a South American myth of a creature with a jewel on its forehead. It also serves as a potential third eye, which is pretty famous as psychic imagery. But these aren't the only references that Espeon pulls from. They are also inspired by the Bakeneko and the Nekomata, a set of cat yokai from Japanese folklore. The Bakeneko is a supernatural cat which gains magical powers as it ages, eventually learning to shapeshift or curse humans. Meanwhile, the Nekomata is a more powerful and dangerous version of the Bakeneko, which only some of their species will achieve after living very long lives, and are often depicted as having split tails and the ability to control the dead or summon fire. A realized Nekomata will bring ruin to a neglectful and abusive owner, or wisdom and good luck to a caring one, which we can kind of see in Espeon, Pokemon which evolves through its connection to its trainer that is said to protect them from harm with their abilities. And Espeon is definitely a Pokemon that you want on your side, having essentially the same stat spread as Jolteon, but flipping its speed and special attack, making them still pretty quick but allowing them to hit like a truck. That said, they are pretty frail and really exemplify the idea of a glass cannon. But functionally, Espeon might be one of the coolest Eeveelutions because of how their abilities tie into their overall design and lore. This Pokemon is all about reading minds, predicting their opponent's actions, and taking advantage of this to take control of the battlefield, and we see that represented in both Synchronize and Magic Bounce. Switching in Espeon at the right time rewards you for predicting what your opponent is trying to do. In the case of Synchronize, you can inflict your opponent with whatever status effect they were trying to put onto your Pokemon, or with Magic Bounce, you can reflect hazards or status moves back to the user. However, this is all pretty reliant on your ability to read what your opponent wants to do. Following Espeon is their counterpart, Umbreon, who is not only the most popular evolution, but also one of the most popular Pokemon of all time. And this is something that we saw reflected in the 2020 Pokemon popularity polls, where Umbreon ranked as the 5th most popular Pokemon overall. And it has only become more popular in recent years, especially with gorgeous TCG releases like the Prismatic Evolutions and Evolving Skies cards, which have been some of the most iconic additions to the game in recent memory. And of course, a huge part of their popularity comes back to their design. It is just very simple and clean, and it leaves it as this iconic looking Pokemon with black fur accented with bright golden rings, which of course changed to light blue in the shiny variant, which objectively just looks fantastic. And that is much more than we can say for Espeon's shiny, but not all of them can be perfect. Even the name Umbreon is cool though, coming from the word Umbra, which stands for the darkest part of a shadow. Notably, Umbreon is a Dark-type Pokemon that was introduced in Gen 2 when this type was added to the games. Despite that, Dark-types were very difficult to get originally. Sneasel basically couldn't be caught until Mount Silver in the original games, though it was a rare encounter on the Ice Path, while the Houndoom line and Murkrow couldn't be caught in Johto at all. And even if you did catch these Pokemon, they weren't really spectacular in terms of stats. The Dark-type was a very exclusive list and all very difficult to catch, and as a result, Umbreon kind of became the face of the Dark-type in much the same way that Gengar was the face of Ghost-types. Umbreon is inspired by both a black cat and a rabbit. In the West, black cats are a symbol of bad luck, however in Japan they are a symbol of good luck and wealth, while the rabbit aspect of its design, which we see mostly in its ears, is likely inspired by the Suki no Usagi, a Japanese folktale about a rabbit that offered itself to feed a beggar. This beggar was actually the moon god in disguise and would take the selfless rabbit back to the moon, where you could see its silhouette on bright cloudless nights. As for Umbreon itself, it is a Pokemon that protects its trainer at night, lurking in shadows to ambush and strike its prey. In contrast to Espeon, Umbreon gets its energy from moonlight and instead is tired during the day. The moon's aura powers the yellow rings around its body, making them glow in an intimidation display when it is about to attack. However, Umbreon isn't really about offenses, and instead it is a powerful defensive wall. To exemplify this, it even has a built-in defense mechanism. When it becomes agitated, it will spray poisonous sweat from its pores. And this might seem pretty strange, as Umbreon is a dark type and not a poison type. However, that wasn't always the case. In the Space World 97 demo, Umbreon had a more purple color and was given the poison type rather than dark. However, this was adjusted in the final version, though the Pokédex entries about it having poisonous sweat remained unchanged. Ironically, Umbreon still remains one of the most iconic toxic users in the game. So in terms of gameplay, at least there is some level of a through line from its original design. The reason they make such a good stall Pokemon is because of all of their highest stats being in their special defense, and HP, with basically no focus on offensive stats at all. Throw in things like Wish or Moonlight for some healing, Substitute or Protect for defense, and Foul Play to turn your opponent's power against them, and you get a really solid defensive option for your team. It's because of this that Umbreon has made so many major appearances in the series. As I mentioned, with Wes in Colosseum, Gary in the anime, and Karen in the Johto Elite Four, just to name a few. Generation 3 wouldn't see any new evolutions, as the game's focused exclusively on using Hoenn Pokemon. And so we can move along to Gen 4, where we get both Leafeon and Glaceon, each of which had location-based evolutions. This was a mechanic introduced in Gen 4 which allowed Pokemon like Magneton and Nosepass to evolve if brought to specific areas. Along this train of thought, if Eevee levels up near a moss rock, they will become a grass type by evolving into Leafeon. Or if they level up near an ice rock, they will become an ice type, being Glaceon. However, as of Generation 8, Eevee will instead evolve if exposed to a Leaf Stone or Ice Stone respectively. Leafeon immediately stands out as having a much more detailed design than many of the evolutions that came before them. A large leafy tail and ears, and several grassy tufts of fur accenting each of their limbs. And speaking of their tail, this is apparently sharper than any master-crafted sword, which is fitting as Leafeon is kind of known for using Leaf Blade. The leaves from its body emit a very pleasant and soothing smell, with younger Leafeons smelling like fresh grass, while older Leafeons smell like fallen leaves. Either way, the air that they emit is so clean and refreshing that it can put other Pokemon into a deep sleep. Inhabitants from Galar also really like this scent, and they use it for air fresheners and even turned it into a popular perfume. However, Leafeon isn't all sunshine and flowers, and when they're exposed to dirty air, they can become angry or violent. In all versions of the Pokedex, we are told that it gains energy and power from sunlight, not like the sunbathing Espeon, but through photosynthesis. And we can see this being demonstrated in Leafeon's abilities. Firstly, Leaf Guard will prevent them from getting status problems in the sunlight, while their hidden ability Chlorophyll will boost their speed in sunlight instead. Chlorophyll specifically can make Leafeon super powerful. It already has decent speed with 95, but with that boost, they can fully take advantage of their high physical attack stat. However, the big surprise in this Pokemon is their physical defense, which is their highest stat at 130. And honestly, that's not what I would expect when looking at it. This is actually the only evolution to have their highest stat in defense in this way, which could make Leafeon really interesting to use if their special defense wasn't abysmal, as well as if the grass typing wasn't overwhelmed with weaknesses. Because of that, Leafeon remains to be a Pokemon that I think is incredibly cool, but is almost never my go-to evolution. Their counterpart for Gen 4 is Glaceon, who is named after glaciers. Glaceon is a return to a more simple evolution design scheme, making use of icy blue diamonds around their body, which also extends to the fur making up their hair, which looks like a Hime haircut. However, the diamond theme doesn't end there. It can control its own body temperature to manipulate its surroundings, and can freeze the moisture in the air to produce glittering ice crystals. Because of this, Glaceon always seemed to be surrounded by a mist of glittering diamonds. Glaceon can freeze its own fur to create icy needles which cover its body. These could be used as a defensive hazard to would-be attackers, launched from a distance at their enemies, or used to produce razor-sharp tackles by ramming into opponents. And of course, this is kind of seen in their abilities, Snow Cloak and Ice Body, which each give different effects in hailstorms and the snow. The first of which boosts Glaceon's evasion, and the second allows them to recover some HP. Obviously, these are also meant to mirror Leafeon's abilities, which are tied to the sunlight. Both abilities for Glaceon are solid options as they are a pretty defensive Pokemon, with their second and third highest stats being in physical and special defenses respectively. However, unlike Umbreon, Glaceon retains their highest stat in special attack, which allows them to hit back decently hard after tanking a hit by making use of Ice-type classics like Freeze Dry or Ice Beam. The biggest problems with this Pokemon are that while their defenses are okay, their health is still pretty low, and much like Leafeon's grass typing, Ice type is arguably one of the weakest defensive types in the game, so a defensive Ice type just almost never works. From there, we are once again skipping another generation as Gen 5 again wanted to use exclusively Generation 5 Pokemon. And so we will move to Generation 6 where we received the newest evolution, the pastel-colored fairy-type Sylveon. Much like Umbreon, Sylveon was kind of the ambassador for a new type, which was added in their game. Though this time players did have access to other fairies pretty abundantly, unlike Generation 2's dark types. Because of this status as the go-to fairy type, both Sylveon's English name and their Japanese name, Nymphia, have connections to mythical fairies. The English name comes from Sylph, which is an air elemental, while a nymph is a Greek nature spirit, and both are often described as being very fairy-like. Sylveon is also heavily associated with Generation 6's Pokémon Ami, an in-game event players could do to fairly quickly raise the affection of their Pokémon. This was important as Eevee needed to have 2 stages of affection while leveling up with a fairy-type move to evolve into Sylveon. In essence though, this has become another friendship evolution, much like Espeon and Umbreon, though unlike being tied to time of day, the only other prerequisite is having a fairy-type move. Now, similar to every evolution other than Eevee itself, Flareon and Jolteon, Sylveon was also designed by Atsuko Nishida, which might be surprising at first glance as they seem to have a much more intricate design than the others. However, when you look closer at Sylveon, it actually does have a pretty simple design, essentially having the same body type as Umbreon or Glaceon, but adding in 2 ribbons with long flowing trails, one on their ear and the other on their neck. It's actually kind of crazy how much these little accents make Sylveon feel like they have a very intricate and well-developed design. That said, these flesh bows are actually very important to Sylveon's lore. They are ribbon-like feelers that release an aura of calming waves which it uses to stop conflict around itself. In more extreme cases of anger, Sylveon can also wrap these feelers around their target to calm them instantly. And it's this act of wrapping their ribbons around others that earns Sylveon the category of the intertwining Pokemon, which can also be seen in their primary ability, Cute Charm, which can cause infatuation in Pokemon who make contact with Sylveon and could stop them from attacking. However, Sylveon's hidden ability is probably more of what they're known for. Pixelate turns any normal type move into a fairy type move and boosts its power, allowing Sylveon to make use of moves like Hyper Voice or even Hyper Beam in a much more effective way. That said, they do already get access to powerful fairy type moves like Moonblast or Dazzling Gleam, so its practical use can be a bit limited. Also, in contrast of Sylveon's description of always wanting to calm down those around it, if it ever encounters a dragon type, it will almost always go on the offensive. And in Galar, they even talk about how Sylveon defeated some great dragon in the past. The biggest downside of Sylveon is that they are the slowest evolution with just 60 points in speed. However, it isn't really trying to be fast anyways. Like Umbreon, Sylveon is a specially defensive wall, and unlike Glaceon, they have a decent enough health pool and a solid typing to support that. While Sylveon's physical defense isn't great, they more than make up for it with their very high special attack. As long as you're smart about when and where you put Sylveon into battle, it can be incredibly difficult for your opponents to deal with. But with that, we have covered all of the Eeveelutions. Each one of them has its own specialities and offers something unique to the team. Whether you need a defensive wall, a quick pivot Pokemon, a powerful special attacker, or just something to offer some support to your team, Eeveelutions can fill just about any role. Let us know your favorite Eeveelution in the comments. Mine has always been Espeon, as I love the magic bounce ability, and it's just so fun to mess with your opponent's plans with it. If you'd like to see more Pokemon videos like this, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and you can check out some of our other videos, like the one where we talk about all of Ash's Pokemon, or where we cover all of the mythical Pokemon. With that being said, thank you all so much for watching, and we will see you in the next one.